The Gulfstream G650 disappeared from radar at 3:47 hours, 17,000 feet above the Hindu Kush, carrying 3 passengers whose combined net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. The aircraft had been en route from Dubai to Singapore when it veered off course, transmitting a single garbled distress call before going dark. By sunrise, every intelligence agency from Langley to Vauxhall Cross had personnel in crisis rooms, because one of those passengers was Marcus Thornfield, the defense contractor whose satellite network formed the backbone of NATO's communication infrastructure. The other two were his daughter and his chief engineer. When the Pentagon's secure line lit up at dawn, the message was clear: find them, extract them, and do it before someone else does. The operational brief landed on Captain Reza Kaviani's desk at Bagram Airfield before her coffee finished brewing. She read it twice, her dark eyes moving across the topographical maps with the measured patience of someone who understood that mountains don't forgive assumptions. The last known coordinates placed the Gulfstream somewhere in the Wakhan Corridor, that narrow finger of Afghan territory wedged between Tajikistan and Pakistan, where Soviet gunships had once fallen from the sky like broken birds. The terrain was unforgiving jagged peaks, narrow valleys, and weather systems that could turn lethal in minutes. It was also crawling with remnants of half a dozen militant groups, smugglers and warlords, who'd consider a downed billionaire a lottery ticket written in American dollars. Reza had flown A-10 Thunderbolt IIs for 8 years, accumulating over 1,400 combat hours across 3 deployments. Her call sign was Nightingale, bestowed during her first tour when she'd stayed on station for 6 hours straight, protecting a pinned-down Marine platoon through a moonless night, rationing her ammunition like a miser counting coins. She'd returned to base with fuel reserves that made her crew chief go pale and cannon rounds you could count on 2 hands. The Marines she'd covered sent her a unit patch with a handwritten note: "You sang us home." The name stuck, though the tone in which it was spoken had evolved over the years, from patronizing amusement to something approaching reverence. She stood now in the mission briefing room, the only woman among 11 pilots and tactical officers, studying satellite imagery that showed nothing but gray rock and white snow. The rescue coordinator, an Air Force colonel named Brennan with a face like weathered leather, was explaining why the conventional search and rescue birds couldn't reach the crash site. The altitude was too extreme, the weather too volatile, and the window too narrow. They needed something built to absorb punishment, something that could fly low and slow, something whose pilot understood that survival often meant being too stubborn to die. The briefing lasted 47 minutes. When Brennan's eyes finally settled on Reza, she was already calculating fuel loads and ammunition configurations. She didn't wait for the question. She simply said, "I'll need full combat load and my wingman." Her voice carried the flat certainty of someone stating observable facts. Brennan nodded once, his expression revealing nothing, but the room's temperature shifted. Everyone understood what hadn't been spoken aloud. This wasn't a search and rescue mission. It was a race against clock, terrain, and human predators, and the stakes were measured in geopolitical consequences. Outside, the Afghan sun was climbing toward its apex, turning the tarmac into a shimmering lake of heat. Reza walked toward the flight line where her A-10 waited, its titanium bathtub cockpit and massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon giving it the appearance of something designed by engineers who believed subtlety was a character flaw. The aircraft was painted in standard Air Force gray, marked with tail number 80242, and scarred with the patina of hard-use hydraulic fluid stains, replaced panels in slightly different shades, and the small dents that came from debris kicked up by the cannon's fury. Her crew chief, a master sergeant named Rodriguez with 23 years of keeping warthogs airborne, was completing the pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness of a jeweler examining diamonds. "Birds ready, Captain," Rodriguez said, his Georgia accent softening the consonants. "Triple-checked the TGP calibration myself. The targeting pod would be essential for finding anything in that mountain maze. Rizan nodded, running her own hands along the fuselage with familiar affection. This aircraft had carried her through situations where physics and probability had both voted against survival. She trusted it more than she trusted most people. Her wingman, First Lieutenant Marcus Chen, no relation to anyone important, a distinction he made frequently with sardonic humor, was performing his own walk-around 2 parking spots over, his A-10 marked with 810-957. Chen was 26, Nebraska-born, and possessed the unsettling combination of exceptional talent and complete absence of ego that made him both reliable and slightly unnerving. They briefed privately, standing in the shadow of Rizaz's wing, away from the cluster of officers who were now conferencing near the operations building. "Rules of engagement are flexible," she said quietly. "If we find them alive and there's hostile presence, we clear the area first, then coordinate extraction. If we find them and they're already compromised, we deny access until the QRF arrives." The quick reaction force was spinning up now, loading into helicopters that would follow once the area was secured. Chen nodded, his jaw tight. Both of them understood the unspoken truth. If they found the Gulfstream's passengers in the hands of militants, the mathematics of rescue became complicated very quickly. 20 minutes later, Rizal was strapped into her cockpit, running through startup procedures with the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions. The twin General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, a sound that had announced American close air support to grateful ground forces and terrified enemies across 4 decades of conflict. She adjusted her helmet, checked her oxygen flow, and scanned the instrument panel where green lights confirmed what her instincts already knew. The aircraft was ready. Tower cleared them for departure with clipped professionalism, and Rizal advanced the throttles, feeling 14 tons of titanium and weaponry begin to roll. The takeoff was smooth, both warthogs lifting off in formation, their landing gear retracting with hydraulic precision. Rizal banked northeast, climbing toward the mountains that dominated the horizon like broken teeth. The sky was crystalline blue, the kind of deceptive clarity that made distances impossible to judge. Her radar warning receiver was quiet, her targeting pod already sweeping the terrain ahead with infrared sensors capable of detecting temperature variations smaller than a human hand. Chen held position off her right wing, his aircraft's silhouette sharp against the emptying landscape below. They flew without speaking, communication reduced to tactical necessity, 2 pilots sharing the same dangerous sky with the easy synchronization of experience. The Hindu Kush emerged from haze like a revelation, peaks rising to 25,000 feet, their slopes painted in gradients of stone and ice. Rizal descended to 15,000 feet, threading through valleys where updrafts could slam an aircraft into cliff faces before pilots registered the danger. Her eyes moved constantly, instruments to horizon to wingman to threat displays, absorbing information in a continuous loop that never paused. The targeting pod's display showed nothing but rock and snow, endless variations on desolation. She adjusted search parameters, narrowing the infrared signature profile to match aircraft debris, still warm engines, anything that suggested human presence in this wilderness. 37 minutes into the flight, Chen's voice crackled through her headset. "Nightingale, I have possible debris field, you're 10 o'clock, 2 kilometers." Rizal banked left, bringing her sensors to bear on the coordinates Chen had marked. The targeting pod's image sharpened, revealing a scar across the mountainside, torn earth, scattered wreckage, and the unmistakable wing section of a corporate jet, sheared off and embedded in scree. The Gulfstream had tried to land, or perhaps the pilots had fought to the very end to control their descent. Either way, the impact had been catastrophic. The fuselage was in 3 sections, spread across a narrow valley floor at 11,000 feet, surrounded by cliffs that rose like walls. Rizal circled, her pulse steady despite the implications of what she was seeing. Thermal imaging showed heat signatures near the largest fuselage section, weak but present. Survivors possibly. She keyed her radio, transmitting to the command frequency. Hawk Ops Nightingale. Wreckage located at coordinates being marked now. Multiple sections, thermal signatures detected. Valley floor, confined space, no immediate LZ visible for rotary wing. She paused, watching the screen. Stand by for assessment. Below, nothing moved except the wind creating small avalanches of loose stone. The survivors, if they'd lived through the impact, were trapped in a location that made extraction a geometric nightmare. She dropped lower, risking the turbulence and decreased reaction time, needing visual confirmation. The A-10's cockpit sat forward, giving her an unobstructed view of the carnage. The Gulfstream's nose section was relatively intact, lying on its side like a discarded toy. The center fuselage had split open, revealing twisted seats and scattered contents. The tail section rested 50 meters upslope, its vertical stabilizer still attached, bearing the registration number that matched their briefing. Movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from behind the nose section, waving frantically, then collapsing to their knees. Rizaz's jaw tightened. One survivor visible, possibly more inside the wreckage. She began marking positions, building a tactical picture in her mind. Then her radar warning receiver screamed. The sound was urgent, familiar, terrible. Somewhere in these mountains, a surface-to-air missile battery had just achieved lock. The system's computer identified it as probable SA-24 Grinch, Russian-made, shoulder-fired, deadly. Rizaz reacted without conscious thought, punching chaff and flare dispensers, banking hard into a climbing turn that crushed her down into the seat with 4 gs of force. The missile's smoke trail appeared below, corkscrewing upward with horrifying speed. She kept turning, bleeding altitude for energy, watching the missile track across her vision. The proximity fuse detonated 40 meters behind her tail, shrapnel pinging off the A-10's armored skin like hail on a tin roof. Chen was shouting coordinates, his own aircraft jinking wildly. Another missile launch, this one tracking him. The valley had become a killing box, and they'd flown straight into it. Rizaz's mind shifted into combat mode, time dilating into the strange clarity that came when death presented itself as a multiple-choice examination. She could see them now, figures moving on the valley's eastern ridge, 6 or 7 militants with launchers and rifles, positioned where the terrain gave them both cover and firing angles. They'd been waiting, she realized. Someone had reached the crash site before dawn, set up an ambush, and turned the survivors into bait. It was tactically sound, professionally executed, and currently being implemented against her with focused lethality. "Break right, Chen, break right." Her voice cut through the radio traffic. She armed her cannon, that 7-barreled monster in the nose carrying 1,100 rounds of 30-depleted uranium ammunition designed to destroy Soviet tanks. Against human targets, it was obscene overkill, but Rizaz had stopped being concerned with proportionality approximately 3 seconds ago. She rolled inverted, pulled through until the ridge line appeared in her heads-up display, and pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, the entire aircraft shuddering as it spat shells at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute. The sound was like God tearing canvas, a basso profundo rumble that echoed off mountains. Rock exploded where the rounds impacted, each shell carrying enough kinetic energy to pulverize stone. The militants scattered, abandoning positions, sprinting for cover that didn't exist when an A-10 was above you and angry. Rizaz pulled off, letting Chen make his run, watching him walk his cannon fire across the ridge with mechanical precision. Secondary explosions bloomed, ammunition cooking off, maybe an RPG warhead. The third missile never launched. She circled back, breathing hard, checking her systems. No damage indicators, all hydraulics green, engines running smooth. Chen was calling status, his voice steady despite having just dodged a missile designed to swat aircraft from the sky. "Nightingale, I'm Winchester on Mavericks, 70% cannon remaining. You." "Same status," Rizaz replied, though her cannon counter showed 83% remaining. She was already calculating. They'd suppressed the immediate threat, but this valley was compromised. More militants would be coming, drawn by the sound of jet engines and exploding ordnance like sharks to blood in water. The survivor below was waving again, more desperately now, joined by a second figure who'd emerged from the fuselage. Two confirmed alive, possibly more unable to move. The extraction helicopters were still 40 minutes out, and 40 minutes was multiple lifetimes in tactical time. She made the decision that would define everything that followed. Chen, establish high CAP, keep sensors hot for additional threats. I'm going down. The words emerged calm, almost casual, betraying nothing of the fear that lived in the space between heartbeats. Chen's hesitation lasted 2 seconds. Understood, covering. His A-10 climbed, establishing a racetrack pattern that would allow him to engage threats from any direction. Rizad descended, flying slower than seemed possible for a jet aircraft. The A-10's massive straight wings generating lift even at 120 knots. She dropped to 200 feet above the valley floor, close enough to see faces, close enough to become part of the landscape rather than something abstract in the sky. The survivors were looking up now, one of them pointing. Rizal recognized the flight suit corporate crew, possibly the pilots who'd fought this dying aircraft all the way down. She couldn't land, the terrain forbade it, but she could do something almost as valuable. She could stay. She could orbit this valley like a guardian angel made of titanium and depleted uranium, and she could make it clear to anyone watching that these people were not abandoned, not forgotten, not free for the taking. Her presence was a message written in jet fuel and cannon fire. Come for them, and you come through me. The radio chatter increased Hawkop's coordinating extraction assets. Chen reporting additional heat signatures 3 kilometers north, probably reinforcements moving toward the valley. Rizal acknowledged each transmission with single-word responses, her attention focused on the tactical geometry unfolding below. She marked positions, calculated firing solutions, and maintained her orbit with the patience of a predator who understood that stillness was a weapon. 28 minutes until the rescue birds arrived. She had fuel for 90 minutes at this altitude and airspeed. The mathematics worked, barely, assuming nothing else went catastrophically wrong. Something went catastrophically wrong. Her radar warning receiver lit up again, but the signature was different tracking radar, probable Zu-23 anti-aircraft gun, Soviet-era twin 23mm cannons that could pump shells into the sky at a rate that turned airspace into a steel storm. The system was northwest, probably mounted on a technical truck, and it was scanning for targets. Rizal climbed immediately, gaining altitude and speed, putting distance between herself and the effective range of autocannons. Chen had already spotted it, was calling coordinates. The truck was moving along a ridgeline road, positioning itself where it could dominate the valley and deny the helicopters any safe approach. "I've got it," Rizal said, her voice flat. She armed a AGM-65 Maverick missile, one of 3 she carried, and designated the target through her targeting pod. The truck appeared on her screen, clear in infrared, the twin barrels of the Zu-23 unmistakable. She fired. The Maverick dropped from its pylon, ignited its rocket motor, and accelerated toward the target with single-minded purpose. Rizal counted seconds. The explosion appeared as a white flash on her screen, then an expanding cloud of smoke. The truck tumbled sideways, over the ridge edge, tumbling 300 meters into a ravine. Secondary explosions followed ammunition, fuel, the rapid disassembly of military hardware. The threat was eliminated, but the implications were darker than the smoke rising into the clean mountain air. This wasn't opportunistic bandits stumbling onto a crash site. This was organized, equipped, and coordinated. Someone had known about the Gulf Stream, had positioned assets to intercept survivors, and was now committing resources to control the area. Rizal keyed the command frequency. Hawk Ops Nightingale, threat assessment upgraded. We have coordinated hostile forces with heavy weapons. This is not a recovery operation anymore. This is contested extraction. The pause before response told her that somewhere in an operations center, people were recalculating risk versus value. weighing the cost of American lives against the strategic importance of Marcus Thornfield's continued existence. The answer came from a different voice, someone senior enough that their rank preceded their words. Nightingale, continue mission. Extraction is go. Repeat, extraction is go. All assets committed. Reza felt something uncoil in her chest, not relief exactly, but the grim satisfaction of knowing that when politics and pragmatism collided, sometimes the right choice emerged. She rogered the transmission and returned to her orbit, her eyes scanning both screens and horizon with renewed intensity. Chen was reporting more movement, dismounted personnel approaching from the north, at least a dozen fighters moving with tactical discipline. The valley was becoming a convergence point, and the survivors were the prize. She descended again, lower this time, close enough that the rotor wash from her engines kicked up dust from the valley floor. The survivors had taken cover behind the fuselage wreckage, smart positioning that used the aircraft's mass as both concealment and barrier. Reza spotted muzzle flashes from the approaching fighters, small arms fire that arced toward the crash site with optimistic inaccuracy. She adjusted her angle, lined up the GAU-8, and made her statement. The cannon's roar echoed off the valley walls, a sound that reached into the chest and compressed the heart. 30mm rounds impacted 50 meters ahead of the advancing fighters, creating a line of destruction that served as both warning and promise. The fighters stopped advancing. Some went prone, some retreated to cover, all of them reconsidering life choices that had led them to this moment. Reza didn't pursue, didn't waste ammunition on targets that had gotten the message. She climbed back to patrol altitude, watching them watching her, a standoff measured in mutual respect for lethality. The radio crackled. Nightingale, Rescue 11, inbound your position, ETA 12 minutes. The cavalry was close now. MH-60 Black Hawks with door gunners and pararescue jumpers who specialized in retrieving people from places that defied retrieval. She acknowledged, then addressed Chen. When the rescue birds arrive, we box them. You take high south, I'll take low north. Anything that moves with hostile intent, we engage immediately. Chen rogered, his aircraft already repositioning. They'd done this before, turned airspace into a protective dome through superior firepower and the willingness to employ it. The next 10 minutes stretched with the elastic quality of combat time, where seconds could feel like hours and entire lifetimes could pass between heartbeats. Reza maintained her orbit, her fuel gauge winding down, her cannon rounds depleting in her mind's inventory even though she hadn't fired since the last engagement. The Black Hawks appeared as dots against the sky, growing into recognizable shapes, twin-rotor helicopters painted in tactical gray, bristling with weapons and carrying crews who'd volunteered for the kind of work that required writing letters to be opened if you didn't come home. Reza established contact, coordinated approach vectors, and watched as they descended into the valley with the measured courage of professionals entering known danger. The lead helicopter flared over the crash site, hovering while its crew chief assessed the situation. Reza could see it all from her position, the pararescue jumpers fast-roping down, their movements efficient and practiced, the door gunners scanning for threats with weapons ready. The extraction took 7 minutes that aged everyone involved. The survivors were loaded 3 total, 2 ambulatory and 1 on a stretcher, Marcus Thornfield himself, unconscious but alive. The militants on the ridge were stirring again, emboldened by the presence of vulnerable helicopters, and Reza found herself back in the cycle of calculated violence that was close air support's fundamental rhythm. She engaged targets of opportunity, not to kill necessarily, but to suppress, to remind everyone watching that the sky belonged to her, and she was neither leaving nor negotiating. Chen was working the southern approaches, his cannon fire precise and devastating. Between them, they created a perimeter of noise and destruction that the rescue birds used to extract their cargo and lift away. Nightingale, Rescue 11 is clear of the valley, package secure, RTB. The transmission carried the relief of people who just finished a job where failure meant body bags. Reza acknowledged, watching the helicopters climb and turn southwest, heading back toward Bagram with their precious cargo. Her fuel was approaching the minimum required for return, and she'd expended 2 Mavericks and 40% of her cannon ammunition. It was time to leave. She radioed Chen, coordinated their departure, and together they climbed out of the valley that had tried very hard to kill them both. The mountains fell away beneath, becoming abstract again, beautiful and distant and no longer actively hostile. The flight back to Bagram was quiet, both pilots lost in private thoughts that combat always generated. Razaf found herself thinking about the figure who'd waved from the wreckage, the desperate gesture of someone who'd been certain they would die in that valley, alone and forgotten. She'd given them something else, hope, maybe, or just the stubborn refusal to let mountains and militants dictate outcomes. Her hands were steady on the stick, her breathing calm, but somewhere underneath the professional composure was the knowledge that she just participated in something that would generate reports and debriefs, and probably questions about risk assessment and command authority. Landing was uneventful, the kind of perfect touchdown that follows horrible flights, the universe's way of balancing scales. Rodriguez was waiting on the flight line, his expression carefully neutral until he saw her climb down from the cockpit safely, at which point he permitted himself a brief smile. "Bird took some shrapnel hits, Captain. Nothing critical, but we'll need to replace a couple panels." Razan nodded, running her hand along the fuselage where she could see the small punctures, evidence of missiles and memories. "She brought me home," Razan said quietly. "That's all that matters." Rodriguez nodded, understanding perfectly the relationship between pilot and aircraft that transcended mechanical function and entered something approaching reverence. The debrief lasted 3 hours, conducted by intelligence officers who wanted every detail, every decision, every observation from the engagement. Razan recounted it all with clinical precision, watching them type notes and exchange glances that suggested implications beyond her pay grade. Colonel Brennan sat in the corner, saying nothing, his weathered face unreadable. When the questions finally ended, he stood and gestured for Razan to follow him into the hallway. They walked in silence until they reached a window overlooking the flight line, where the sun was setting behind mountains that looked almost peaceful in the golden light. "Marcus Thornfield is conscious," Brennan said without preamble. "He's asking to meet the pilot who stayed over the crash site. Says you circled for 43 minutes, that he counted every pass, that he knew as long as he could hear your engines he wasn't alone." He paused, watching Razan's reflection in the glass. "Command wants to know if you understood the strategic value of your package before you committed to the low orbit." It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that determined whether she'd acted from tactical brilliance or fortunate ignorance. Razan turned to face him directly. "I knew there were survivors who needed time," she said simply. "Everything else was just math and fuel calculations." It was both true and incomplete, the kind of answer that revealed character while protecting operational security. Brennan studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, apparently satisfied. "You'll probably get a medal you can't talk about for a mission that officially didn't happen," he said with the dry humor of career military navigating classified absurdity. "Welcome to the strange part of this war." He walked away, leaving Razan alone with the sunset and the diminishing adrenaline and the quiet knowledge that she'd done exactly what she'd been trained to do, no more and certainly no less. That night in her quarters, Razan sat with a cup of terrible coffee and thought about the waving figure, the desperate gesture, the human need to be seen even when dying seemed inevitable. She'd given them visibility, presence, the promise that someone was watching and would not look away. It was a small thing, maybe, measured against geopolitical stakes and strategic calculations. But it was the thing that mattered, the reason she joined, the purpose that survived bureaucracy and politics and the grinding machinery of institutional indifference. She finished her coffee, set the cup aside, and allowed herself the luxury of satisfaction, brief, private, and entirely earned. The official reports would call it a successful high-risk extraction. The classified assessments would note her tactical decisions and their outcomes. But in the spaces between words and documentation, in the informal networks where pilots talked to other pilots, a different story was being told. It was about Nightingale, the captain who dropped into a valley full of missiles and militants and stayed, who turned her A-10 into a shield and her presence into a promise, who'd sung people home through cannon fire and determination. The story spread with the peculiar velocity of military mythology, gaining details and emphasis while remaining fundamentally true at its core. Marcus Thornfield recovered fully, as did his daughter. The chief engineer had died in the initial impact, his sacrifice buying the others precious seconds during the crash. The militants who'd set the ambush scattered after the engagement, their tactical discipline no match for American close air support, and the political implications of attacking a rescue operation. The Zu-23 and missile launchers were added to intelligence databases, tracked backward through supply chains and networks, contributing to larger operational pictures that existed far above Rizaz's security clearance. The Gulfstream's wreckage was eventually recovered, analyzed, and cataloged. The investigation would take months, the conclusions classified, the real story probably stranger than the official narrative. 3 weeks later, Rizaz was flying a routine patrol when her radio crackled with an unexpected call sign. "Nightingale, this is Thornfield Actual." She recognized the voice older, raspy from the injuries sustained in the crash, but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Marcus Thornfield had somehow obtained access to her tactical frequency, which suggested resources and determination that probably shouldn't surprise anyone. "Go ahead," she replied, keeping her voice professionally neutral despite the irregularity of billionaires calling fighter pilots mid-flight. "I wanted to say thank you," Thornfield said, "for staying when you could have left, for making noise when silence would have been safer. You gave us something to hold on to when everything else had fallen apart." Rizaz didn't know how to respond to that, so she defaulted to the truth. "I was doing my job, sir. Glad you made it home." There was a pause, filled with static and the background noise of wherever Thornfield was calling from. "Captain Caviani," he said finally, using her full name with careful pronunciation. "People like you are why people like me can take risks that matter. That's not nothing." The transmission ended before she could reply, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the sky and the knowledge that sometimes the moments that define us arrive without warning, disguised as routine missions and impossible choices. Her squadron mates noticed the change in how people referenced her. The call sign, Nightingale, had always been spoken with respect, but now it carried something additional, a weight, a recognition, an acknowledgement that she'd proven something beyond routine competence. Younger pilots sought her guidance with new earnestness. Mission planners consulted her on operations requiring precision and nerve. She remained the same person, moved through the same routines, but the world's perception had shifted incrementally, and perception in military culture was currency that could be neither forged nor stolen. Rodriguez approached her one afternoon on the flight line, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "This arrived for you, Captain. Came through official channels but from a civilian source." Rizaz opened it carefully, revealing a unit patch custom-made, hand-embroidered, showing an A-10 silhouette above a nightingale bird, the design intricate and clearly expensive. A note accompanied it, written in neat handwriting. "For the pilot who taught us that angels sometimes fly in armored aircraft." With gratitude, MT, she held the patch for a long moment, feeling the careful stitching, understanding the symbolism and sentiment. Then she handed it to Rodriguez. "Put it with the others," she said quietly, referring to the collection of unit patches and commendations that decorated the squadron's heritage wall. The story of that extraction would follow Rizaz through the rest of her career, appearing in fitness reports and recommendation letters, referenced obliquely in classified briefings and tactical reviews. But the moment she returned to, alone in the cockpit at 20,000 feet with only the sky for company, were simpler. The figure waving from the wreckage, the sound of her engines echoing off mountain walls, the choice to stay when leaving would have been safer. These were the memories that mattered, the proof that in a world of strategic calculations and institutional machinery, individual decisions still created ripples that touched lives and changed outcomes. She flew missions for another 6 years, accumulating hours and experience and the quiet reputation that came from consistent excellence under pressure. Other emergencies arose, other valleys needed entering, other decisions demanded the kind of courage that looked like ordinary professionalism until examined closely. She never spoke publicly about the Thornfield extraction, the classification ensuring that particular story remained fragmented and unofficial. But on flight lines and in ready rooms, wherever A-10 pilots gathered, someone would eventually mention Nightingale and that valley in the Hindu Kush, and younger pilots would lean in to hear how one captain had turned 43 minutes into a masterclass on what it meant to stay when everyone else would have left. Years later, promoted to major and assigned to a training squadron, Razaf found herself briefing new pilots on close air support doctrine. She used the Thornfield case as an example, names redacted and details sanitized, but the tactical essence preserved. "The question you'll face," she told them, her voice carrying the weight of experience translated into instruction, "is not whether you can accomplish the mission. It's whether you'll stay with it when conditions deteriorate and risk exceeds reward on paper. The answer defines everything." The pilots listened with the focused attention of people who understood that lessons this hard-earned didn't come from textbooks. On her final flight before rotating stateside, Razaf flew her over the same mountains where she'd once made decisions that mattered. The valley was invisible from altitude, hidden among countless identical valleys, but she knew where it was, could have navigated to it from memory. She didn't descend, didn't circle, just acknowledged its presence and continued her flight path. Some places marked you, changed you, asked questions about who you were and who you wanted to become. That valley had been one of them. She'd provided her answers through action, through staying, through the stubborn insistence that people mattered more than safety margins and calculated risks. The mountains passed beneath, eternal and indifferent, keeping their secrets the way mountains always had. Somewhere down there, wreckage still remained, being slowly reclaimed by weather and time. Somewhere else, people lived who remembered being trapped and hopeless until they heard engines overhead, saw an aircraft that refused to leave, understood that they were not abandoned after all. These parallel truths existed simultaneously, shaping narratives and defining legacies in ways that transcended official records and classified reports. Razat turned her aircraft toward home, leaving the mountains behind but carrying their lessons forward, ready for whatever came next.